Okay, so I'm going to get things started now. Welcome to today's seminar delivered by Zoom. The seminar is Key Insights into the Effects of and Recovery from Wildfires, and it's going to be delivered by Professor David Lindenmayer. My name is Saul Cunningham, and I'm the Director of the Fenner School of Environment and Society. So just to confirm, David, can you give me the thumbs up that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Saul.
Terrific. All right. So although I can't see you all, I can. My computer tells me that we've got almost 90 people online at this point. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining. We've got people zooming in from their homes in Canberra, where we're on Ngunnawal country. And some of our guests will be coming from all across Australia, where the traditional owners come from many different First Nations people. So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all these lands, and by recognising that First Nations people are the custodians of deep knowledge of forests and fires, which are the topic of today's seminar. So I'd like now to introduce Professor David Lindenmayer, and that's a hard thing to do in just a few minutes because David's got an incredible back catalogue of academic achievements, and in parallel to that, a long record of contributing to public debate about natural resource management in Australia. When it comes to the scientific literature, David is one of the most prolific publishers in his field globally, so not just in Australia, but worldwide. And his work is amongst the most cited by other scientists in his field. So David has a remarkable academic history and reputation. David's a member of the Australian Academy of Sciences and was awarded an Order of Australia. And of course, he's a member of the Fenner School, the school that is bringing you this seminar today. So this record might lead you to imagine a scientist who's tied to his computer writing all the time because David's so productive, or perhaps wearing his tweed jacket and smoking a pipe with the other academic dignitaries at the Academy of Sciences. But that's actually not David. You can even see David on Zoom now. He's not wearing a tweed jacket. David is remarkable in how he manages to keep engaged in the actual, the field work that underpins his research. So more than most scientists at his career stage, he's really still out there in the forests and in the other field sites, really understanding in a hands-on way the topics that he's dealing with. So that's one of the things I most admire about David. It's not book knowledge, or it's not exclusively book knowledge, it's actually the deeper knowledge you get by really being out in the field and doing that work. So there's more we could say about David, but I'll leave it there by way of introduction. I'll invite David to speak in a moment, but I wanted to explain that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the seminar, and the way we would like you to do that is at any time you can type a question into the chat function. So if you look at the bottom of your screen and move your mouse, you should see a little box called the chat box. Open that up and type in a question if you have one. There's also a Q&A box, but we're going to try and use the chat box instead. So whenever you want, put something in the chat, and at the end we'll go through as many questions as we can. I don't know, given that we've now got more than 100 participants, I don't know that we're going to find time to read actually all those questions, but give it a go. So, and then the other thing to note is that this presentation is going to be available on our website by YouTube later in the day, and we'll make sure that's linked to the website so that you can find it. So with that procedural stuff by way of introduction, that introduction of David, I'm going to ask David to give us the presentation for today. Take it away, David.
Thank you, Saul, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about really what's about the last nearly 4 decades of work on fire as it relates to forests and biodiversity response. And I just wanted to acknowledge the slide that has been taken by someone else. This was the 2003 fires around Canberra, and you can see this extraordinary lightning storm during that fire event on that fateful day. Okay, so some further background. We've been working in Southeast Australia for nearly 40 years, and fire has been a fundamental part of every single one of our large-scale studies through forests, plantations, and woodlands. And we've essentially been watching what happens after fire since 1983, right through to the fires that we've just had in 2019-20. And I'd have to say, often what I hear, particularly from shock jocks, is exactly the same now as I heard 37 years ago. And we'll come to that in a moment. But fire has been part of our studies in a number of the books that we've written, and quite a large proportion of the scientific peer-reviewed studies that we've published more recently and over a long time. So our group is extensive, but it looks at a whole range of ecosystems throughout southeastern Australia, and two of them are going to be the focus of this talk. One is at Burni National Park, or Jervis Bay Territory, and we'll talk about that one later in the talk. And the other one is in the Central Highlands of Victoria, quite close to Melbourne, which will be most of what we're going to discuss in the next 45 minutes. From the other perspective on this, even though I'm very much a person of the forest and of woodlands and elsewhere, I'm also acutely aware that fire has an enormous personal impact, and those can be very long lasting. This is actually a photograph of my mother-in-law, and it's a picture taken a couple of weeks after the 2009 fires, which absolutely ravaged their property and many of the properties surrounding them, as well as killing a number of our friends in the Central Highlands region. So fire has massive mental health impacts. There's a lot of complexity associated with the hazard reduction burning issue, which we'll talk about briefly, and there are enormous impacts both on people and on property. So in this talk, what I wanted to do was briefly touch on a series of topics. The first one is to do with the links between fire and climate, and they're very strong ones. And then again, very briefly touch on issues around hazard reduction burning and house loss, work that's been led by Phil Gibbons and Jeff Carey here at the Fenner School. And then what I wanted to do was to talk around some themes to do with fire. The issues around the condition of the vegetation before fire, impacts after the fire and how we manage those, and then the different kinds of responses that different species have to fire, and then conclude with some of the issues about thinking more deeply about what can be done in this fire space. So let's put the recent fires in Australia into some context. They were, by some estimates, more than 12 times larger than the Amazon fires that happened in 2009. So approximately 903,000 hectares of tropical rainforest was burnt in the Amazon last year, as opposed to the 12.3 million hectares of southern Australia that was burnt. We had over 1 billion individual animals lost, according to estimates from Chris Dickman at the University of Sydney, and John Quiggin's estimate of an overall cost of more than $100 billion of those same fires. But I think that's simply one fire that we're looking at, one fire season. And as we'll see as we go through the rest of this talk, we actually need to look much more broadly and deeply than a single fire to really understand what's happening. So just briefly, some of the key definitions of terms around fire that are often not well interpreted in the media or in the general public. And that is that fire intensity is actually the amount of heat generated, usually estimated in units such as kilowatts per square metre. So that's different from fire severity, which is the amount of damage that's done to the vegetation by fire. Now, the really important thing in this context is what we call the fire regime, which is a sequence of fires over time, the fire history in terms of the number of fires, the time between fires, the time since fire, the season that it's burning, and other things. And a wildfire is an unplanned fire, which is different from a hazard reduction burn, which is planned and usually takes place in the non-wildfire season. So in southern Australia, that would be winter. Now that's different again from a backburn, which is a planned fire during a wildfire that's lit to try to backburn and aid in fire suppression. And that's different again from a blackout burn, which is where green areas within the fire footprint are actually blackened out by additional fire. And as we'll see later in the talk, these have highly significant negative impacts on biodiversity recovery. A regeneration burn is when the debris left after logging is burnt, and that's used to stimulate the regeneration of an area that's been logged. And finally, a cultural burn is a kind of burn that's applied by Indigenous people, and that's done for a whole range of reasons, whether it's to bring on food plants or to create green pick for animals which might later be hunted. Now, the important thing here is that these categories are not necessarily independent. There are quite a number of cases where hazard reduction burns have become wildfires, and back burns have also got out of control and become wildfires. So fire is a key ecological process in almost every terrestrial ecosystem. And in fact, when you do long-term, large-scale research like we've been doing for many decades, fire becomes an essential part of almost every one of our large-scale long-term studies and those of many of our colleagues. However, when a fire regime is altered, it can become a key threatening process. In fact, for groups like birds, it's the second most important key threatening process, only to land clearing. So with all of these aspects of fire severity, fire intensity, fire regimes, the management of fire is incredibly complex. And to do it well, you need to base your decisions on evidence, evidence-based policy, evidence-based management. But the complexity here is really quite difficult, because every fire is different, given all those aspects of the fire regime. Each species responds to fire in quite a different way, and we'll talk about that again later. And then the sequence of fires is important. For example, the number of fires can have a big impact on what species are present in an area. But also the spatial pattern of fire has very big impacts, whether the fire is uniform or whether it's patchy. As we'll see in a few minutes, the condition of the environment before a fire has an effect not only on the fire itself, but also on the recovery process after the fire. And also what we're now discovering more and more is that fire interacts with other things, such as logging, but also feral predators and feral herbivores. And all of these things add up to make the management of fire one of the most complex parts of ecological management. So here's an example, a real example from the Central Highlands of Victoria. This is an area not too far from Marysville, outside of Melbourne. And on the ridgetop, we have an area that's had a history of past logging and then salvage logging, and it's been subject to very high severity fire. And the middle part of this image shows the extent of canopy removal and impact. So in the mid-slope area, fire has burnt at lower severity, and you can see that through the overhead canopy shot in the middle there, the amount of blue sky. And that's different again from an area further down into the gully and away from the ridgeline, where the forest is largely unburnt. So not all parts of landscapes are created equal in terms of the fire severity, fire intensity, and fire impact across the landscape. And in an Australian context, this often occurs. We see extensive resprouting of native forests and woodlands. And this is associated with changes in the hormones within trees when the canopy of the tree is removed. Now, many ecosystems are able to resprout and resprout quite vigorously. This is about 3 months after the 2009 fires. But I need to say here that what we're seeing in places that are burnt repeatedly, such as in East Gippsland, these kinds of rapid responses are starting to wane, which means that some trees may be susceptible to repeated fires at short intervals. Okay, so let's switch very briefly to the links between climate and fire. So the two key long-term drivers of fire are climate and weather. And essentially you get very few fires when temperatures are cool and conditions are wet. And so the reason that this is important is that when we account for the effects of fire, we actually have to take into account the effects of climatic conditions and fire weather. So for example, when we're modelling the effects of fire severity, we need to take into account what's called isochrones, which tell us the time that a particular fire occurred. So for example, in the case of the 2009 fires, it matters whether or not you're looking at a forest burnt at 1 o'clock in the afternoon as opposed to 6 o'clock in the evening. We'll come to that in a moment. So there's no doubt that the climate on the planet is changing and changing very quickly. So the background levels of CO2 in the atmosphere over the past 800 years have been around about 280 parts per million. When I looked at the Mauna Loa monitoring station in Hawaii on March the 6th, they were 413 parts per million. Now this is important because there's a strong link between temperatures and levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. And 2009 was the hottest and driest year on record in Australia and the second hottest planet-wide. And the IPCC suggests that we're going to be 1.5 degrees warmer relative to background long-term rate levels by 2030. So this is not modelled information necessarily, and this is shown by the measurements that were started by David Keeling in the late 1950s at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And what you see here from the black line is the strong increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the reason I put a little arrow here was that in 1981, I was a Pimpley undergraduate doing plant physiology experiments, and you can see that the atmospheric CO2 levels at that time were somewhat under 340 parts per million, and now we're sitting at well over 410 parts per million. Just as an aside here, the up and down red lines here are the seasonal variations in carbon in the atmosphere associated mostly with plant growth. So then if we look more broadly at continental changes in things such as temperature, you see these extraordinary levels of temperature across the continent in 2018, 2019, and also for large parts of the country, highly depressed levels of rainfall. So we've got two of the key ingredients that underlie changes in climate and weather and its impacts on fire. And this is a summary report published on the 14th of January 2020, which essentially pulls together insights from 57 different articles looking at the links between climate change and risk of wildfire. So now let's go to hazard reduction burning. And these dot points really build on work that's been led by Phil Gibbons and Jeff Carey at the Fenner School. And they did a really seminal piece of work on house loss and property damage as it related to the fires in 2009. And some key things arise from this work. The first one is that it's actually the quality of hazard reduction burning that matters rather than the quantity. Now, the reason that I put that in here is that there's been a lot of discussion about, for example, if only we had done more hazard reduction burning, none of this would have happened. Well, in fact, what we know is that hazard reduction burning is most effective if it's done reasonably close to infrastructure and it's done reasonably frequently. But for example, after the Royal Commission in 2009, there were efforts in Victoria to burn roughly 5% of the state every year. Well, the only way that you can reach those kinds of target levels is to burn very remote areas that are a long way away from people and infrastructure. So that's actually what we call Goodhart's law, where the aim of the game is to reach a particular target, but it may not actually have the benefits that we're looking for. So distant burning targets will often have limited effectiveness. Now, the other thing that's important here is that under extreme conditions, hazard reduction burning will not always be effective. And this is an image of Marysville following the 2009 fires. And this is a particularly difficult image for me to look at because I spent quite a bit of my life living and working around this place. And some of our friends in this town lost their lives in February 2009. The reason I put this slide up was that in December 2008, I was giving the keynote address at a statistical conference in Marysville, and the air was unbreathable, and it was very difficult to see because of the amount of smoke around the town as a result of hazard reduction burning. So hazard reduction burning was done, but it didn't have an effect in terms of mitigating the impacts of the wildfires that occurred in 2009. It's quite a sobering lesson, and it's wrong for the media, particularly the shock jock media, to tell people that if only we would have done more hazard reduction burning, none of this would have happened. Because it gives people a false sense of risk reduction relative to what's happening. Okay, let's move into the realm of forest ecology, and an area that our group in particular has worked on extensively for the last 25 years. This is one of our long-term sites in the O'Shanassy water catchment, and you can see a photograph of yours truly standing next to some extraordinary trees in this area. This site was burnt at moderate to low severity in 2009. And we can see that most of the trees and most of the biomass is actually still in the forest. But there are some really important insights that come from repeated surveys and studies of these areas, as we've done in the last few years. Now, this is opposed to places that have been logged and regenerated and then burnt. What we see is very different kinds of what we call biological legacies. And the pre-fire conditions make a huge difference to the forest recovery process and the impacts of fire itself. And there's a very big difference between the effects of fire in a young forest relative to the effects of fire in an old forest. And what the data show us is that in general, fire is much lower in severity in older forests. Animals are much more likely to persist in these older forests than in younger ones. The recovery rates of the ecosystem is much faster, and the recolonisation of these areas by species is also much faster. And I've put the citations to the different papers at the bottom here, and there are other ones presently in press or in review. Now, the other thing that's been discovered is that a forest that has been logged and then regenerated is likely to burn at higher severity than a forest that is old. So there are two red arrows on the graph in this slide, and what it shows you is the probability of canopy fire as a function of stand age. So what happens is that these forests are very unlikely to burn from years 0 to 7, and then from 7 to about 36 to 40 years, the forest burns at a much higher probability of canopy fire. And then that effect doesn't subside until the forest is approaching approximately 100 years old. Now, you don't find these effects if you don't do the appropriate statistical analysis and look for what we call nonlinear effects, which is what Chris Taylor did in the paper that's cited at the bottom here. Now, there's actually nothing unusual here. This has been seen globally in a review that we published in 2009, but we've also started to see this in new analysis of new areas following the 2019-20 fires, plus reanalysis of areas burnt in 2009. But the thing that's important here is that other people are seeing these same kinds of effects, for example, right up into northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland. And in a paper that was published last week with other researchers from the University of Tasmania, independently finding the same kinds of effects where fire severity is lowest in older forest and highest in young regrowth forest. So why do we think this is occurring? The first one is that logged forests have large amounts of logging debris. So that's tree heads, lateral branches, non-merchantable trees, bark, understory plants that are left on the forest floor. Now, this debris is burnt in a regeneration fire, and approximately half of it is volatilised as smoke, which people, for example, in Melbourne, which is in the background of this photograph, would be breathing in April or May. The other half of it actually stays in the forest, and it adds to the fuel load of the regenerating stand. The second thing that happens is that when forests are logged and regenerated, we lose a significant portion of the wetter components of the forest. So that includes things such as tree ferns. And the late David Blair's work shows that the reduction in tree ferns is about 96%. The third thing that happens is that the young forest that regenerates is growing very quickly. And that has two impacts. One is that it uses a large amount of water to transpire to the atmosphere, so it dries out the system, which is why younger forests produce significantly less water than old forests. The other thing that happens is that there's a change in the forest architecture, and that change leads to rapid self-thinning and self-pruning, which produces fine and medium fuels. And it also creates a dense wheat field of young, very dense trees that adds to the potential for ladder fuels and moving the fire through the system. Now this effect, as we saw in the previous graph, will go for roughly 40 years after harvesting. And so that means that a forest that's logged tomorrow still has that elevated fire severity risk that takes us out to about 2060, or when I'll be about 100 years old. Okay, now let's move to after the fire. So some really important aspects of forest ecology here. The first thing is this concept of what we call biological legacies. So these are the trees, the shrubs, the seeds, the whole animals, live animals and eggs, other things that are left in the forest directly after a fire. So these living and dead materials, these biological legacies, are critical in how the forest trajectory will roll out, how the forest will recover. And that's because these legacies allow species to persist on sites. We'll talk about that some more in a moment. The legacies speed the rate at which the forest recovers, and it also creates extra habitat complexity, which is critical for many species. And amongst those species are some of the possums and gliders, which do occur in young regrowth forests, including forests that have been burnt, but only if there are large old trees, which are the biological legacies that are left after fire, or in some cases also logging. So this is important because what we know is that post-fire forests can vary in their suitability. So what we call an early successional forest with a lot of large old trees as legacies, so they're the acronyms I've got there. An early successional forest with large old tree legacies. Mammal colonisation of those forests can be around 10 to 20 years. But without those legacies, they'll be unsuitable habitat for up to 170 years. So a conceptual diagram of this looks like this. And so this relates to the probability of animal occurrence in relation to the time since fire and the time at which fire has occurred. Some other aspects after the fire, and this is also quite controversial, but we've been looking at the effects of post-fire logging, also called salvage logging, since 2004, and written books on this and quite a number of papers. And what we know is that salvage logging removes almost all of the large old trees, and that can set back the recruitment of new habitat by up to 2 centuries. We know that salvage logging has very substantial effects on the vegetation, including the loss of tree ferns. Elle Bowd's work at the Fenner School shows that salvage logging has quite profound effects, long-term effects on soils, but there are other impacts on groups such as birds, plants, invertebrates. And work from the Pacific Northwest of the USA suggests that salvage logging can have quite strong short-term and medium-term effects on elevating fire risk. From what we understand of all the work that's been done in this space, including a meta-analysis which will be published in the next few weeks, post-fire logging is the most damaging form of logging. So there's some empirical work on birds showing exactly that. And that was published a couple of years ago. And this is taken from some work led by Elle Bowd, showing relationships between the numbers of disturbances, including salvage logging, as shown in the red boxes, in relation to different key elements in forest soils, ranging from ammonium through to sulfur. And I have to say here that if people are interested in following up any of the material here, I'm happy to receive emails and then send you out papers. The other thing that's really important in an Australian context is that the vast majority of forest ecosystems and ecosystem types will actually recover naturally without further disturbance. And that's really important for several reasons. The first thing is that most of these forest environments are not geared to deal with high intensity recurrent disturbances such as post-fire salvage logging. The second thing that happens is that these trees will actually recover naturally without further disturbance. And so it's best to leave these systems to recover without salvaging them. Okay, so now let's look at what we call biological interactions. And this is interactions before the fire and after the fire. So in the Central Highlands region, fire is the main form of natural disturbance. And the mean fire interval, as identified by Mike McCarthy at the University of Melbourne, somewhere between 75 to 150 years in these ecosystems. These are wet eucalypt forest ecosystems. What we've seen in these same ecosystems, though, is we have had 5 major wildfires in the past century. So that's 1926, 1932, 1939, 1983, 2009. So other things are happening in these landscapes. And what we see is that there's a significant part of most landscapes, and this photograph is by far, it's a very common perspective in these systems. What we see here in the white polygons is the boundaries of logging coops in the system, and the yellow marker shows us the time that those forests were logged, and we can see at least a dozen logging coops in this system where the forest has been set back to use 0, then regenerated and has started to grow. So you need to remember that previous graph that we looked at about the relationships between sand age and fire severity. So what we've been proposing is going on is that widespread logging is creating young forest, and that is increasing fire risk. With repeated fire, we have repeated burns in this young forest, and it keeps it young. So if we look at this Central Highlands region where we work, what the area statements show us is that 98.8% approximately is 80 years or younger. So the forest is dominated by young forest. And that's important because what is happening is that these landscapes are now changing from being largely old growth forest with small patches of regrowth within them to the other way round, dominated by young forest with very small patches of scattered old growth within them. So we can actually start to think about what this looks like in terms of a conceptual model that links the extent of old growth in the landscape, young forest then is able to mature, then to become old growth, relative to logged landscapes where we have small areas of old growth that are embedded within large areas of young growth, and that young forest is either subject to reburning and at risk of collapse, or only a limited amount of that forest will actually be able to mature and then become old forest. And we can actually see these kinds of changes when we start to pull together the disturbance layers from the Victorian government. And what we see here is that very little of these forests now are actually more than 1,000 metres from a disturbance boundary. So in wood production forests, the distance between a patch of forest and the next disturbance boundary is 71 metres, as opposed to within the protected areas we're being close to 1,700 metres. So this was work that was published just a few months ago in Austral Ecology. And you can look at that in any way you want to, spatially on a map or in histograms. Here, and what we see is that the extent of fragmentation, proportion of the landscape in different distances from a disturbance boundary. Okay, now why does that matter? Well, it matters a lot for biodiversity because the most recent analyses that we've done is looking at the abundance of animals, for example, arboreal marsupials, looking at how populations are changing over time, and then looking at their relationships, for example, with the amount of harvesting that's going on in the forest, as well as the amount of fire. So the red box on the extreme left side is for the greater glider, which has declined dramatically. We'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And then we can see, for example, leadbeater's possum at the top and the sugar glider at the bottom, essentially responding in opposite ways to the amount of harvesting in the landscape. So leadbeater's possum is declining, but the sugar glider is increasing. So what we know is from other areas is the sugar glider is actually quite a weedy species, and it responds very strongly to disturbed landscapes. And so there's a risk, a possible risk that as time goes on, the sugar glider may well continue to replace leadbeater's possum in some of these disturbed environments. So that provides a segue across to thinking a little bit more deeply about the relationships between fire and biodiversity. So some animals are killed outright, and this is leadbeater's possum on a site after the 2009 fires. But other animals seem to be able to persist in some circumstances. So at the time of the 2009 wildfires, Sam Banks had a population of mountain brush-tailed possums fitted with radio transmitters. And after the fire went through the area of habitat where the possums were being radio tracked, Sam discovered that every single individual animal actually survived the fire. And not only that, subsequent recruitment of new animals in the population was based on the individuals that had persisted. He could see that in the genetic signals. Other species, such as the aptly named flame robin, can actually colonise log sites of burnt sites very quickly. And so that's a different strategy again to some of these others, such as leadbeater's possum and the greater glider, which have continued to decline long after the wildfire. And we can see that in the case of the greater glider, which has declined dramatically in the last 20 years. And what is likely to be happening here is that one of the key factors driving the decline is the loss of the large old hollow trees. And there is a link between the decline of these species and the decline in hollow trees. Let's now move to another system and move to Burni National Park, where we've been studying since 2002. So this is a truly iconic area on the south coast of New South Wales. It's its own territory. And it's an area where there's been some quite neat studies done of the effects of fire, the effects of herbivores, the effects of predator control, and their interactions. So this work is continuing. It's coming up to its 18th year. And one of the biggest fire events took out roughly half the park in 2003. We were very fortunate to be able to work in this area immediately after the fire. And what was discovered that many of the species that were thought to have been likely to be eliminated from these kinds of places actually remained in the burnt areas despite very high levels of fire intensity and severity. So here's a good example. This is the eastern bristlebird. It's an endangered species. Burni National Park is a stronghold for the remaining populations of these animals. And it was thought to be very, very highly fire sensitive. So what we wanted to do was to look at what was happening with the eastern bristlebird and be able to compare the presence and absence of the species on burnt sites versus what happened on unburnt sites. So the advantage of being able to study at Burni was that we had data on what was happening before the fire, what was happening after the fire, and then what was happening on burnt sites versus unburnt sites. So we have a bit of a summary of this here. What we call this is what's known as serial site occupancy. And we're able to look at, for example, in the top line, the unburnt sites, and the A stand for absent. And on unburnt sites, there are sites where the birds are always absent, as shown by the string of capital A's there. But there are also sites where the birds are always present, which is shown by the string of P's. What we then want to see is what's happening on the burnt sites. And 17.5% of bird responses show that the birds were always there on the burnt sites, as shown by the string of P's. In the second line there, we have birds that are present before the fire, in the first letter P, then absent in the year after the fire, but then they recolonise and they're present again, and that's occurring in 20% of responses. And then in 10% of responses, we've got 2 years where the birds are absent before they recolonise the sites. So the bottom line here is that birds are either persisting on burnt sites or they're quickly returning. And the rate of return is strongly associated with the amount of green in the landscape. You can see in the image to the right, classic unburnt patches, and that strongly affects the ability of birds to either persist or return. And the outcome of this is a recommendation not to do blackout burning in these kinds of environments because these unburnt areas are key refugia. But there's a bit of a sting in the tail, and that is that what we see is that the bird species richness on long-term sites is strongly linked to not that one fire, but actually the number of fires over time. And this is critical. We see that with an increasing number of fires, there's a reduction in bird species richness of 9.1% for every fire over time at that site. Now I wanted to move to some work that's been led by Claire Foster. And this looks at the interrelationships between fire, predator removal, and increased numbers of herbivores. And this is still at Burni. And what we want to look at here is that when a fire moves through these landscapes and removes the vegetation, that vegetation then starts to resprout or it germinates. That vegetation can be very palatable to animals such as macropods. So we know that fox control has been relatively effective in this system. We can see that through the number of fox baits that are being taken and the number of detections of foxes. And what we also see is that there's been a relatively systematic increase in the numbers of herbivores such as swamp wallabies in this photograph, but also the eastern grey kangaroo. So what Claire was wanting to do then was to ask key questions about what happens when we put macropods and fire together. And do they affect the vegetation? And does that affect the fauna? So Claire set up a series of exclosures, quite large exclosures, that kept macropods out of the ecosystem, but at the same time she had control areas that weren't fenced and intermediate areas that were fenced but had gates which allowed animals to have access to the vegetation inside the enclosed area. And so when we have fire but no macropods, we see quite a strong recovery in the vegetation cover with quite a range of different plant species. That's opposed to these areas that have high numbers of macropods that have been, and the area's been burnt, and the system's largely dominated by unpalatable bracken and flaxily. And we can see that with data sets. There's a big difference in the vegetation between burnt and unburnt and exclosed and open. And that has cascading impacts on other species, such as the brown antechinus. You can see the difference there, particularly between seasons for exclosures versus partial areas from Claire's work. So there's some implications from this, and that is that after fires, we need to be very careful about how much supplementary feeding we do for herbivores. The reason for that is that if we maintain highly elevated populations of these herbivorous animals, they may well have quite strong effects on the recovering ecosystem, and changes to those ecosystems may well have cascading effects on other species. And Claire has seen that quite dramatically with animals, particularly spiders, which are a key part of the food chain in these environments. Okay, so now what I want to do is to talk about fire in relation to other natural resource industries. And this comes from some work that was published a few days ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what has been done here is very simple. Essentially what we've done is mapped the location of fire across the state of Victoria, how many fires have occurred, when they occurred, which kinds of areas were burnt, and what was the land tenure in those areas. So this was published in this paper on Monday, or Tuesday our time, Monday American time. And what we see is that there's a significant increase in the amount of forest that's burning over time. There are many areas that are burning 2, 3, and sometimes even 4 times, 25 years. And 59% of everything that was planned to be logged in the East Gippsland area in the next 5 years was burnt in the previous fire season. And 30% statewide, almost 30%, was also burnt. So what's happening here is that fire is actually competing with forestry for the timber resource, and fire is winning, and winning quite extensively. So if we look at this in more detail, and this is some work that's being led by Jeff Carey at the moment, is that under a changing climate, we're seeing more fires at a shorter return interval. So the time between fires is contracting. We know that for some ecosystems, such as the wet and damp ecological vegetation classes, we should see fire on average somewhere between 75 to 150 years. We also know from work led by Mark Bergman that the optimal short sawlog rotation for growing sawlogs should be somewhere around about 100 years, 80 to 100 years. So it's possible to look at the fire frequency on the return interval relative to the rotation time. And this influences whether trees get to an age that produce sawlogs in this system. And what we find is that very, very few stands of trees are reaching a harvestable age under these fire regimes. So we know that there's an 80% chance that stands of these kinds of important trees will be burnt before they get to 80 years old. So what this means is there's a very high level of uncertainty in the resource, and there's really a very poor level of return on investment for the state and for the logging industry. Important thing here is to think more broadly about the industry itself. So in Victoria, 87% of all native forest goes into the wood chip and pulp stream. And this is ABARES data on the state of the forests. At the same time, the state produces 3.9 million tonnes of eucalypt pulp logs from plantations, but exports 2.9 million tonnes. So there is an opportunity here to divert part of that resource into the chip and pulp stream and process it in Victoria. Now, the other side of this equation is that 88% of all the sawn timber in Victoria already comes from plantations, and it's a similar number in New South Wales. And most of the jobs in the forestry sector are actually in plantations. Now, work from Tasmania and recently published suggests that plantations are going to be more defendable in the face of fire. So I think there's a need to think about where we're extracting resources from and where they have the best and highest value. So for native forests, the economic and environmental accounting work that's been done by Heather Keith and Michael Varden suggests that the best return on investments will be from water production, carbon storage and tourism. And from plantations, the best and highest value will be for wood products. And Heather's allied work shows that in terms of carbon emissions, we're best off to source our wood from plantations. And again, we can provide the documents to support that outcome. All right, so to conclude, where does this work lead us? What can be done in terms of thinking about fires and policy? Well, the first thing is, I think we need to think about fire in a multi-scaled way. The first one is to think about climate and weather as the key drivers of fire and fire behaviour. And then underneath that, to think about how that relates to hazard reduction burning. So we know that, for example, hazard reduction burning will not be effective under extreme conditions. But where hazard reduction burning can have an effect is when it's done regularly and it's done very close to houses. And Phil Gibbons and Jeff Carey's work also shows that there is significant value in removing vegetation close to houses in terms of protecting lives and property. If we go to the other side, in terms of forest management, I think we need to think carefully about logging where it increases fire risk and the impacts of salvage logging. And as an aside there, we have been looking at evidence of thinning effects in wet forests, and I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. So what else do we need to do? Well, clearly, if climate is a key driver of fire, then we need to think deeply about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's from the transport sector and elsewhere. But the flip side of that is that we also need to think deeply about long-term carbon storage. And this is where I think there's an important role for native forests in storing large amounts of carbon in the land sector. We need to do better hazard reduction burning with respect to house loss, but understand that it's not a magic bullet. There will be times when it doesn't work. And I have to commend the Victorian government for times under extreme conditions when it was appropriate to move people out of areas where there was a very high risk of loss of life. The other thing is we need to be careful about simple solutions. I know there's a lot been discussed about Indigenous burning, and it is useful to have those discussions, but it's important to recognise that in some circumstances, Indigenous burning or hazard reduction burning is not appropriate. In wet eucalypt forests, that isn't the fire regime that will allow those forests to persist, nor in rainforests. And given how much fire we've seen, particularly after the last major fire events, 2019-20, many ecosystems simply don't need any more fire. They actually need less disturbance to be able to start the recovery process. Other simple solutions, such as thinning forests, generally have quite limited effects, and in some cases they will actually make fire risk and fire severity greater. So there is a need to think about increasing the amount of long unburnt old forest where fire severity is lowest. And it's important not to be logging forests that become more fire prone as a result of harvesting operations, particularly near human settlements. And we shouldn't be logging burnt areas. Salvage logging is extremely detrimental. There's extensive data to show that. We also shouldn't be logging or burning unburnt refuge habitats, particularly large old tree, areas with large old trees and green spots. And as an aside here, our latest analysis indicates that Victoria's lost 77% of its old growth forest in the last 25 years. So the old growth areas become extremely important refugia. There's also an important task to be done in targeting what might be key assets and protecting them during fires. And I think the good news story around Wollemi pine is a good example. And critically, also, we've got to think about tackling interactions with exotic species. We know that foxes and cats will move very large distances to hunt their prey in burnt areas. And we know that animals such as deer and horses can have massive impacts on vegetation recovery after fire. Now, the other thing that's really important here is that almost everything that we have discussed in the last 20 or 30, 40, 50 minutes is based on long-term monitoring, collecting very high quality long-term data sets to give us the insights that we've come to. So if people are interested in further information, I'm happy to send reprints and other information out to you from the talk. And then just finally, I wanted to thank a whole range of people who've made, and organisations that have made the work possible that we've done. And I wanted to dedicate the talk to 3 people, very important people, that have very recently passed away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. It's hard to give a round of applause when you're on a virtual webinar, but round of applause. It was a fantastic review through some really significant work. Now, we do have some good questions that have come through in the chat line. I'm going to read these questions out one by one to David to give David a chance to respond. And if you have a question, put it into the chat line and we'll see how many of them we get to. So the first question, David, comes from Karen O'Cleary. And she says, she asks, how best to rehabilitate 40 acres of far south coast forest on the Bega River, burned in the 2018 Primary Ridge, Reedy Swamp, Tathra fires?
Okay, good question. And it's very hard to give general information without seeing the details of the particular area. But some of that riparian vegetation will have a reasonably good chance of regenerating naturally, but there may well be important requirements to actually do some additional planting. That would require land care and Greening Australia people to have a careful look at that. I think there's an important need to avoid the temptation to remove dead trees, except where they're a safety hazard, and also removing. It's good not to remove logs and other things because they can become really important nurse sites for other plants to regenerate. Now, the fallen trees are also important because work by Philip Barton and others at the Fenner School shows that those fallen trees actually create little micro refuges from over-browsing by macropods. And so that allows other plants to be able to get established and started. So there are some things that can be done. The Threatened Species Hub through the Fenner School and elsewhere around Australia has produced some really good information about a blueprint for recovery, and there's some details about some of the things that can be done and that shouldn't be done that can help with those restoration processes.
Great, thanks, David. The next one comes from David Gallen, and he says, we've known for a decade or so about the drying effect on leaf litter, even in wet Tasmanian gullies, due to small average increases in temperature over time. Last spring saw Queensland rainforest burn. To what extent will climate change see the loss of natural fire retardant landscape features such as present-day wet rainforest gullies?
Yes, that's a good question. There's no doubt that temperatures are increasing and humidity in some parts of Australia, rainfall in some parts of Australia is declining. And I know that there's been real concerns about, for example, southwest Western Australia from that perspective. And there's no doubt that some of the Gondwanic relics, northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, did burn. What we do know is that from other parts of the world that older forests tend to be more mesic, more stable microclimates. That's work led by Matthew Betts. And so there is a need to think about how do we maintain those older forest environments if we can. In other cases, we will need to think about what happens to the adjacent areas. There's some suggestion from workers at Macquarie University that the North Coast Gondwanic relics were most badly damaged in areas where there'd been extensive adjacent disturbance by logging, which seemed to dry out the environment and allow access to places that might not otherwise have been burnt. Now that work isn't published yet, but I know that it's reasonably well advanced. But there has been some careful thought about the spatial adjacency of environments and its impacts on drying environments. So again, it reinforces this idea of the importance of intact environments in relation to fire.
Thanks, David. The next question comes from Bob Conroy, and he asks, what do we know of the relationship between fire regimes in tall open forests and the frequency of hollow-bearing trees? Okay,
there's quite a lot been written on that. What we know is that frequent high-severity fire does take out a substantial number of the large old trees. That work was published in 2011 and again in 2018. So that's a really substantial problem. It's also related to the age of the forest at the time of the fire. So we know that if an old forest is burnt, the fire is less severe and the biological legacies are larger and likely to persist for longer. There's a strong relationship between the probability of tree collapse and tree diameter. So what we also know is that areas that were 15, 20 years old, up to 80 years old, that were burnt in the 2009 fires, the trees in those areas were either likely to be consumed or they're too small in overall diameter to have the internal volume that will become hollow-bearing trees. I can follow that one up, Saul, with papers if people are interested.
Right. So I can tell you lots of questions are coming in. So
all right.
Terrific. So the next one comes from Sean Burke. And Sean asks, what evidence is there of wildfire frequency and intensity prior to European arrival?
That is a little bit out of my area of expertise. What we do know from the work that Chris Taylor and I published a couple of days ago is that the extent of fire has been increasing quite significantly, particularly over the last 50 to 70 years. We also know that prior to white settlement, based on what age class structures there appear to be in some forest types, is that there are extensive areas of old forest. So in the Central Highlands, somewhere between 30 to 60% of the landscape is old forest. And those trees would not be able to persist in a landscape subject to high frequency, high severity fire. So that suggests that fire was less frequent and less severe over large parts of the landscape. Otherwise that forest wouldn't exist in that age class structure. And it's likely to be the same in parts of Tasmania.
Okay, the next question comes from Jennifer Johnson, and she asks about the increase in the number of sugar gliders relative to other possums. Could this also have a long-term negative effect on certain bird populations, given that we know sugar gliders can exclude birds from hollows?
Yes, that's a good question. So that paper isn't published yet. It's about to go back to the journal after being reviewed and revised, but the data show that the sugar glider is increasing. And the sugar glider is different in the mainland as opposed to Tasmania because it's a native species on the mainland, but it's an introduced species in Tasmania. So there's some subtleties in terms of what the potential impacts are. There does seem to be some evidence that the sugar glider does better in disturbed environments relative to some of the other more disturbance-sensitive species. So there is a chance that the sugar glider may well increase with increasing disturbance. Although, having said that, it is also hollow dependent, and it is also, in wet forests in particular, strongly associated with the abundance of large old trees. So the decline in those big trees may well drive a decline in those species as well. So there are some subtleties in that. Tasmania, gosh, it does have a massive effect, and other work led at the Fenner School shows that in spades, that it has a big impact on bird species.
Yeah. So the next question comes from David Freudenberger. So you referred to the idea of ecological collapse, and David's asking what ecological collapse are you seeing in the Central Highlands?
So in the Central Highlands, there is a strong risk of ecological collapse because of the paucity of old forest and the risk of significant reburning, which would occur at a time period too short for trees to start to naturally reseed effectively. One of the differences in that system is that there are large seed stores that have been collected by the Victorian government so that they can be artificially reseeded. But there are potential impacts on other plant species beyond mountain ash as a dominant tree species. Now, once we start to go further out into East Gippsland and some of the wetter forests there where there's been 2, 3 and even 4 fires, then we really start to get into serious problems. Now, beyond that, there's also some evidence found by some workers at University of Melbourne that the recurrent fires in some of the drier mixed species forests may be suppressing the resprouting ability. So yes, there's some deep concerns about ecosystem susceptibility under these conditions. The longer term trajectory is not a happy one either. There's other work suggesting that temperature and rainfall regimes might by 2070, 2080 be so extreme that some tree species couldn't persist because it's outside of their bioclimatic domain.
Okay, the next question comes from Kelly Small, and she asks, why is hazard reduction burning going ahead now if the bushland's been so disturbed? It appears as if the land management that hasn't worked is still just going ahead as usual.
Oh, that's a very complex question. So hazard reduction, the data on hazard reduction burning, extensive and complex, but there's also a lack of empirical data in other places. The data do show that from Phil Gibbons and Jeff Carey that hazard reduction burning does need to be done close to human settlements and to protect lives and property. I don't think that there's a case for doing hazard reduction burning in very remote and distant areas because it's an opportunity cost. It costs a lot of money to do hazard reduction burning. You often don't have a long time to do it, and you're better off to be focused quite close to areas that are near settlements. I think there'll be individual cases where there needs to be careful thought about where you do it. If an area has just been burnt and is recovering, then you wouldn't venture into the hazard reduction burning space because it's just been burnt. So there needs to be thought about the policy about where you do it, how often you do it, how that juxtaposes with human settlements, and the protection role that you want to play for lives and people.
Okay, thanks, David. The next question comes from Christina Gee, She says, thank you for the presentation, and then asks, what's the purpose of burning green refuge areas, which was one of the observations you made in the course of the presentation.
So it has been a practice at times to do blackout burning. It has happened where there are green areas and there are concerns that areas might be burnt during that process. Some blackout burning did happen in the fires we've just had, 2019-20, including in parts of New South Wales out in the Blue Mountains area. It's an extensive practice in North America as well. And so the purpose is to not have areas that are at risk of burning during a major, that are green, but during a major fire. I think on a biodiversity basis and a protection basis, mostly blackout burning can't really be justified.
Okay, so Karen O'Cleary asks, has this information in total been sent to the various bushfire inquiries?
I've been asked to make submissions to the Royal Commission, which I've done, and I've been asked to provide information from these various studies by various people sending me emails, which I do. And then I've been asked by government representatives and others to provide a bit of a summary of this body of work, which I've also done when I've been asked to do so.
And the next question comes from Renee Gonlag, and she says, she asks you to comment on the difference between indigenous burning, cultural burning, and hazard reduction burning in terms of impacts on biodiversity.
Okay, so we need to strip back what the concept of indigenous burning. So several things are important here. We need to remember that indigenous people were not one group. There was 350 odd nations, individual nations, and different nations burnt country in different ways for different reasons, and even men and women within those different nations burnt country in different ways. And there were extensive places that were not burnt. There is no evidence of extensive hazard reduction burning in the wet forests of Victoria or the cool temperate rainforests of Tasmania, because if they were repeatedly and extensively burnt, they couldn't exist. The other thing that's important in this context is that the reason Aboriginal people burnt their country was often associated with cleaning up or doing burns to produce food. So they were different than in the context often of what we might think of hazard reduction burning. So there are some similarities, but there are also some really big differences. And those differences do matter. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from Indigenous people about the way that they burnt their country, but it needs to be done in an equitable way, not just stealing knowledge, but actually true partnerships. But it also needs to be done in a context relative to what the infrastructure is there now, what the land uses are now, and in the context of protecting human lives and property, and where you spend your budgets on hazard reduction burning, because it is expensive. It's very labour intensive, and you often don't have a big window to be able to do it.
Okay, so Amelia Croucher asks, how do you break the cycle of young forest burning and then recreating young forest? Apart from not logging them, what can be done?
That's a good question, and it's exercised our minds for quite some time. One important thing to do is to look at the landscape. Not all parts of landscapes are created equal. There are some parts of landscapes that are much wetter, much more sheltered, much less fire prone, for example, flat plateaus. And so they might be places that you first begin to target for the process of landscape restoration to try to regrow the old growth estate. And so there are ways of using environmental modelling, but also other data sets to start to look at where are the intact areas now, where were previous areas of old forest, and begin to reconstruct landscapes that way with some good science to underpin it.
Okay, Kelly Small asks, will government ever consider changing logger regimes based on scientific evidence that it's detrimental in its current form when contracts are signed for up to 10 years?
I think there needs to be some deeper thinking in this space. The reality here is that the frequency of fire, the spatial extent of fire now and in the past means that resources are declining dramatically. So this creates enormous uncertainty for the industry. And if we're serious about socially just transitions, for example, in Victoria, we need to actually think about where do we get resources to maintain these kinds of forest industries. And that's why I had that slide up saying, you know, this is not the end of the forest industry. There are actually alternative resources through the plantation sector to be able to support the industry. Now, there are other things that very gainful employment that can be done for logging contractors. You know, they have amazing heavy plant skills, heavy plant machinery skills that are really important in firefighting. So I think it's incumbent on government to think about how we make those transitions and learn about where transitions have been successful and where they haven't been. It's important to understand that under the regional forest agreements, the regional forest agreements are agnostic about where they get their feedstock to feed industry. That is really important. There's nothing in the RFAs that says you can only log native forests to get your timber. You can get them from elsewhere. So what is really happening is that fire is competing with native forest logging for forests, and we're going to have to change where we get resources so we can grow the crops quickly, which you do in plantations. You can protect them better, which we can do in plantations. And by and large, most of what's produced from native forests now can be exchanged for what comes out of plantations.
Okay, Wyn Jones asks, some of our ecosystems in the mountains have burned far too frequently and now show an unhealthy condition with few animals and almost no invertebrates. What are your thoughts on ecosystem reconstruction? Ideas like the translocation of key fauna to restart the ecological cycle?
Yes, I think translocation is expensive and high risk, but in some cases it's going to be necessary for some elements of the biota. You know, we've seen this, for example, in Kangaroo Island with the Kangaroo Island Dunnart, where animals had to be taken into captivity, and we may have to be doing similar things for potoroos and other species. So again, there's a lot that science can help guide us here to think about what will be sensible reconstruction ideas, what's appropriate restoration. And again, we need to look at what's intact, because that's one of the principles of restoration, is thinking about what's intact and how do we build on that, and what might be the best decisions to make relative to the resources at hand. So this is where things like decision theory comes in to help guide what might be good decisions in certain areas. There's a lot to be done in this space, and really that's the challenge for the next 10 years for places like the Fenner School and elsewhere, is to think about restoration and reconstruction in heavily disturbed environments.
So the next question comes from Maria Cardoso, and she says, when assessing fire severity versus logging, were different harvesting intensities at different sites also considered? There seems to be an assumption that all logging is created equally, when that's certainly not the case. Do areas that were selectively logged or where habitats retained burn at less intensity and severity, for example?
That is an excellent question. And what we've done, what's been published so far, the work from Tasmania and our work in the Central Highlands, has looked at wetter forests where the silvicultural system is clear felling. Some other work that's presently in review, led by Chris Taylor from the Fenner School, looks at the relationships between fire severity and past logging operations, either thinning or clear felling, and it looks at it in drier forest types and wetter forest types. And the results are interesting, and there are some strong subtleties in it. So thinning makes no difference to fire severity. Clear felling makes it worse in wet forests. Thinning has a different effect again in mixed forests. It has some effect in younger forests, but it makes it worse in older forests. So I said before in the talk that thinning is not going to be a major solution to the problem, and that's because of what the empirical results are showing. Now, that's not published yet. It's in re-review. It's had extensive analysis and reanalysis, and there'll be further work in this space as well.
So Harriet Swift asks, what advice do you have for the New South Wales EPA and Forestry Corporation, which have recently started logging in burned forests on the far south coast?
Expect the effects to last for the next 200 years, up to 200 years. We'll need to look very carefully at the impacts on aquatic systems, mass wasting of soils, long-lasting effects on soils. I think it makes relatively little sense in terms of likely return on investment. Salvage logging is cutting burnt trees, and burnt trees, by and large, don't go to make great saw logs. I think there's actually a need for a very careful economic look at the economics of salvage harvesting, because around the world, in the vast majority of places, salvage harvesting is a major loss maker. And I think it's important to think about these major fire events as a way to restructure industries. So in Victoria, we know that the state government was planning on exiting at 2030, but the extent of fire means that there's no chance they can make even that time in 10 years. New South Wales has been burnt even more extensively than Victoria, and there really does need to be some really deep thinking about the structure of the industry. You already know that most of the timber comes from plantations in New South Wales. We need to think deeply about how that resource is managed and the size of the industry relative to the crop. We know that in Victoria, after the 2009 fires, where extensive areas of forest was burnt, the industry's rate of cutting didn't slow down for about 7 to 8 years after the 2009 fires, and the resource was badly overcut as a result. So I don't think that leads to a good transition. So there needs to be careful thought about that.
The next question comes from Susie Webster, and she says, I know this is not really your area, but there are many fungi symbiotic with plants and trees in Australia, and some of these fungi do not fruit until their hosts are between 800 and 200 years old. With such a small amount of true old growth left, what numbers do you think are either lost or clinging to life in the way of these special fungi?
Wow, that's a complex question, and it is out of my area, but Elle Bowd, who's been working on this at the Fenner School, has shown that there are really major differences in the fungal associations and the microbiome in old forest versus young forest, and particularly some kinds of symbiotic fungi, mycorrhizal fungi. So yes, there'll be big changes. The old forests become really important as part of a living laboratory to be able to make those comparisons.
So the next question comes from Shoyo Nakamura, who asks, where else in the world outside of Australia are we likely to see such intense fires? Okay, so there are parts of the Pacific Northwest where we can have very high severity wildfires, and there are some broad analogues between those temperate conifer forests and some of the wet eucalypt forests in Australia. There are also very high intensity and high severity fires in parts of the boreal systems of Canada and Russia, particularly Canada. The next question comes from Steve Rowan-Jones, and he asks, how much are federal and state governments and authorities paying attention to the science, the proposed responses, which cut across the range of interests, and taking action? And if the answer is not much attention, then what can we do to make the necessary changes?
Yeah, that's another good question. And part of the role of the Fenner School is to try to make sure that we do policy relevant, management relevant research, which is what we've tried to do. It requires not just publishing papers in scientific articles, it requires a lot of other communication work and providing short fact sheets and other things. Some of this information does penetrate policymakers and politicians' minds. Some of it doesn't. It's a long, slow process. One of the things that is important if you're going to make recommendations to change things, you need to think carefully about what the economics of it are. That's why we've done economic and environmental accounting. But it's also important to think about what the social implications of it are. So bringing other perspectives to it. I think all that can be done here is to continue to communicate the case for what the science is showing and thinking about it in a policy relevant context. Now, I know that's not necessarily the most satisfying answer, but that's what we've tried repeatedly to do for prolonged periods of time in this space, to try to make sure that people can connect with the work and continuing to do really good work over long periods of time to collect together a body of evidence.
So I want to point out that it's 23 past 12 now, so we've still got 7 minutes allocated, and I want to commend David for plugging away at this great list of questions, but we're going to keep going. It's possible that we're not going to complete them all. So the next question comes from Julie Vulcan, and she says, my question relates to eucalyptus species, regeneration, and the encouragement of some species over others in recovery. And the context is Napai and Bargo. The personal context is Balmoral, which was hit by the Greenwattle Creek fire. So her observations on the ground suggest that some more resilient bushfire species, like grey gum, have suffered population declines due to being logged, as charcoal trees have allowed less resilient and taller trees like the mountaintop ash, zebraite, to proliferate. The former have survived strongly, while the latter have been weak in recovery and suffered more mature tree deaths. So is there research that suggests the encouragement of re-establishment of originally endemic and more robust fire species within habitats can serve to create more stable fire habitats?
Yes, wow, there's a lot to that question. And to some extent it needs really quite deep thought. So there's some, in some cases there will be a case for thinking about more fire resilient species in particular areas, particularly if you've got very high frequencies of fire or very high severity fires that are occurring often. But there's a potential downside to that, and that is that some of the most important tree species for animals like koala and possibly also the greater glider may not do well in this high fire frequency environments. And I have to go to an example that I know, and that's silvertop ash in East Gippsland in southern New South Wales. Silvertop ash has a range of nutrients that are highly tied to the tannins and other components of the leaf, which means that the nutrients are not accessible for those leaf feeding specialists. And so the changes, silvertop ash is basically a fireweed, and the changes in the composition of the forest associated with logging and fire is changing the system in a way which is making extensive deserts for greater gliders and koalas. So whilst I think there is some reason for thinking about encouraging more fire resilient tolerant species, it does need to be thought about in terms of the other things, the other beasties that might be associated with them. Sorry, that's a complex answer, but I think it is a complex problem.
It's a complex question. So the next question comes from Kevin Harding. And actually, I would characterise it as a comment more than a question, but I'll read it out and give you a chance to respond, David. So Kevin says, if hazard reduction burning is not supported by distant burning in a well-planned mosaic pattern, it will almost certainly be overwhelmed by megafires starting and gathering steam in unburnt areas, as seen in 2009 in Marysville. Both are important, particularly if the weather patterns are increasingly more severe due to climate change trends. So do you have any comment to make on that?
There are some data that suggests that for significant risk reduction to occur with hazard reduction burning, you actually need to do a very, very, very large amount of burning across the landscape to have a preventative impact. And given the limited resources available, it seems, to me at least, more tractable to focus on areas where the data suggests that we're going to have more of an effect on protecting houses and property. But under extreme conditions, where we get these mega fires, we're not going to be able to protect particular places, as shown at Marysville, as shown at Mallacoota, as shown at Cobargo. And under those circumstances, the outcome may well be to be moving communities completely away from these kinds of catastrophic events. So there's some trade-off analysis to be done there and some risk reduction analysis to be done. And I know that Jeff Carey and Ross Bradstock have done some of that.
So we're down to, we've only got about 3 minutes to go. I'm going to ask you one more question. I'd like to apologise to the various people whose questions we haven't actually made it to. It's been great that so many people have engaged. So I'm going to ask you one more question, David, and then we'll just make some closing comments. So the last question comes from Jennifer Johnson, and she says, are we now potentially caught in a vicious cycle after these 2019-2020 fires, where we have a large area of regenerating eucalypts which will readily burn again, given also the pressure to do more fuel reduction burning due to the new regrowth in the Bristol communities, and also our ecosystem starting to change to a larger dominance of these fire responsive species, which will readily burn during the next bushfire. Educating the community about the right type of management that won't make the risk worse in the long term is very challenging when they can see the fuel from the regrowth in front of them.
Yes, therein lies the complexity of, probably the last 50 or 60 or so years of land management and what we might be able to do about it. I think we have to do a number of things in this space. I think we need to go back and look at all the commissions of inquiry that have been into bushfires in the last 50 years, and there's lots of them. I think we need to look very deeply at what some of the science is showing, including some of the controversial science. And it's beyond simply pumps and hoses. And there's often been a focus on that. I think we need to think carefully about where we're building our houses, how we're building those houses and what's next to them. And I think we really have to think carefully about the vegetation that's been created. And the data suggests we have to be really careful about trying to expand the areas of less fire-prone, older vegetation where fire severity is lower across the landscape. So there are some really important things to do. One of them is, for example, in Tasmania, to leave some of the more extensive intact areas of forest as intact forest, rather than creating extra problems now that we might have to live with for the next 30, 40 or 50 years. We're seeing a legacy in East Gippsland and to some extent probably also in southern New South Wales of extensive past disturbance, which only begets more disturbance, which is essentially what the question is asking. So we're going to have to backtrack, recognise that what we've done in the past is not getting us to a good place, and rethink what we're going to do here, including new industries associated with elite firefighters in regional towns, looking at long-term carbon storage, because we know that a lot of carbon still stays in the system even when it's burnt, and rethinking where we get our timber from.
All right, thanks, David. I think we need to give you a break after a solid hour and a half. So I just want to thank you again for a really stimulating presentation and for that fantastic question and answer session. I'd also want to point out that we had more than 120 people in that session, and we've still got 80 people online who've stuck it out all the way to the end of the Q&A. So really fantastic engagement. I want to thank everyone for joining in to the conference. So thanks all, and look for more Fenner events on the Fenner website. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Saul. Thank you, everyone.